The autumn air still clung to my sleeves as I set out the last of the burgundy napkins along my dining table. 72 years had taught me to value ritual supper on Sundays. Candles in their holders, the comfort of pot roast simmering in the oven. My colonial home in Asheville creaked with the kind of familiarity that calms a widow's heart. Celestine arrived with the sound of high heels striking hardwood, her husband, Marius, trailing behind, silent as ever. They brought along Marius's mother, Mrs. Greffin, who walked into my home as though it were hers, gaze already assessing the china on the table. We settled around the oak, steam rising from platters, forks clinking. For a few minutes, conversation meandered weather, road construction, the grocery lines. Then Celestine straightened, her smile deliberate, and said in a voice pitched just loud enough to cut through the small talk, "We'll move into her lakehouse while our place is under repair." The words struck harder than any storm. I looked at her, my own daughter, as if she were a stranger. The lakehouse my refuge after Harold's death. The place where I patched my life back together board by board had been claimed without a question, without even the courtesy of a request. Before I could find breath to respond, Mrs. Greffin reached into her handbag and produced a small brass key, twirling it between her fingers like a trophy. "Celestine made me a copy," she said, eyes glittering, so thoughtful of her. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. They had not only spoken of it, they had acted, slicing into my life as if I were already gone. The silence at the table thickened until Celestine broke it with a laugh too sharp to be kind. "Mother, don't look so shocked. You've let that house sit empty for years. We'll make good use of it." Unless her eyes narrowed, "You're going to be cruel." Cruel? The word hung in the air, heavier than the scent of roast beef. I folded my napkin carefully, each crease a shield, and felt something inside me settle into place. Not anger, not fear, clarity. I knew then the lakehouse would not be surrendered, and the fight for it had already begun. I drove to Lake Junaluska the spring after Harold's funeral, the mountains still damp with rain. Realtors had shown me neat cottages with vinyl siding, manicured lawns, and no history. I chose instead a battered structure by the water, paint peeled to gray, porch sagging, windows blind with mildew. They told me it wasn't worth the asking price. I bought it anyway. The first summer nearly broke me. Storm water had chewed through the lower floor, leaving boards warped and walls crumbling. I hauled soaked furniture out to the yard myself, watching it collapse into piles that smelled of rot. Neighbors walked past, shaking their heads, but I kept going. One beam replaced at a time. One bucket of nails. One evening spent sanding until my hands blistered. I remember the night I slept there for the first time. The house was still raw, stripped down to studs, but I laid a blanket on the floor beside a lantern. I listened to the water lapping the shore and felt, for the first time since Harold's heart stopped in his sleep, that I might breathe without drowning. The work stretched into years. Insurance paid less than half of what repairs demanded. So I bartered lessons, sold quilts, and dipped into savings I should have guarded. Yet each improvement became a stitch in my healing. The oak floors gleamed again, the porch stood firm, and new windows caught the light of dawn over the lake. By the time appraisers valued it at $616,000, I no longer cared about numbers. That house was the place where grief cracked open into survival. I had stood alone against floodwaters and loneliness, and the walls remembered. So when Celestine's voice claimed it as a convenience, calling me cruel for resisting, I felt not guilt, but a rising flame of possession. That house was not empty. It was me rebuilt. And I knew, as I folded my napkin that Sunday, the battle would not be fought in words alone. The roast had grown cold on our plates by the time Celestine lifted her chin, eyes glittering with practiced defiance. "You're cruel, Mother." "For saying no?" "Families share." Marius shifted in his chair but said nothing, his fork tracing idle patterns in the gravy. Beside him, Mrs. Greffin gave a slow, deliberate nod, lips pressed in satisfaction as if judgment had already been passed. The weight of their gaze pressed against me like a verdict. I sat very still, hands folded in my lap. Cruel. The word echoed through me, sharper than I expected, but it did not wound as it once would have. For the first time in years, the sting of accusation didn't leave me trembling. Instead, something steady began to rise. Anger without guilt. Flame without smoke. The silence in the room felt staged, like a courtroom waiting for a confession. I let them sit in it, their own voices the only testimony. Above the archway, near the molding I'd painted myself, a discreet red light glowed on the security camera. I had installed the system last winter after a pair of burglaries nearby. Tonight, it served a different purpose. Every word, every insult, every false performance was being captured. Celestine leaned closer, pressing her advantage. "You don't need that house. Mother, you rattle around in this old place while the lakehouse just sits there. Do you really expect 3 children to suffer when you could help?" Her voice carried the tone she used in arguments she always won, but I no longer bent beneath it. I only folded my napkin again, aligning the corners as if I were preparing evidence of my own. Mrs. Greffin patted Celestine's wrist in approval, as though cruelty had changed definitions while I wasn't looking. I met their eyes, calm and unflinching, knowing the camera preserved every second. The meal limped to its end, dishes clattering half-heartedly, conversation fractured. When I rose to clear the table, my steps were measured, steady, and unafraid. I carried the plates to the sink, certain now that their accusations had given me more than hurt, they had given me proof. After the last dish was washed and the dining room stood empty again, I leaned against the counter, hands braced, and let memory carry me backward. Harold had been gone 30 years now, his heart giving out in his sleep when Celestine was barely in high school. The morning after his funeral, I folded away my lesson plans and resigned from the small college where I taught literature. Teaching had been my joy, but single motherhood didn't leave room for joy. It demanded survival. I took work wherever it could be found: substitute teaching, secretarial hours, evenings behind a cash register. Celestine needed braces, then a car, then tuition. Each check I wrote felt like giving her a rung on a ladder while I slid further down. When she wanted graduate school, I cashed out the last of Harold's insurance. When credit cards caught up with her, I signed over my savings account. And when Marius's startup collapsed, leaving them with nothing but promises and unpaid invoices, I mortgaged the lakehouse's first round of renovations to cover their debts. I told myself it was temporary, that parents did such things. Love was measured in sacrifices. Wasn't it years bled into decades, and I barely noticed how small my own world had become. My quilts gathered dust, my books half read, my teaching license expired. I had built a life around patching theirs. Stitching closed every hole they tore open. I believed love would be recognized, maybe even returned. Now, at 72, I saw it with clearer eyes. All those rescues had not grown gratitude, but entitlement. What I thought were gifts had been reinterpreted as dues. Celestine believed I owed her still, that the house I bled to rebuild after Harold's death was simply the next payment. I pressed my palms flat against the counter. Steadying myself, love, too freely given, had become their currency, and I knew then that I would never spend myself so carelessly again. The following morning, I pulled the renovation folder from my desk drawer. Its papers neatly signed and dated. Ready for the battle I knew was coming. A week later, they came again, unannounced. Voices carrying down my hallway before I even opened the door. Celestine led the charge, Marius at her shoulder, and Mrs. Greffin close behind with that pinched expression that passed for superiority. "We've been talking," Celestine said, sweeping into my living room as though she owned the air. "The kids are excited. We'll only need the lakehouse for a few months. You won't even notice we're there." I let them settle on my sofa before walking in with the manila folder I had prepared. I set it carefully on the coffee table, its neat stack of contracts and city permits a quiet counterweight to their noise. "You might want to look before you plan any further," I said. Celestine frowned, but flipped open the folder. Renovation agreements, permits stamped by the city clerk, start dates, and projected 9-month timeline all signed and sealed 3 months earlier. Marius leaned closer, eyes widening. Even Mrs. Greffin's mouth tightened as though the ink itself had betrayed them. "You planned this," Celestine's voice cracked. "I did," I answered evenly, every wall down to the studs. "Construction begins next week." Silence stretched across the room. For once, their arguments stumbled. I could almost hear the weight of their disappointment shifting. That night, after they left in tight silence, I sat at my desk to return the papers to order, while sorting receipts. A misdirected email blinked across my screen, forwarded by mistake from Celestine's account. My breath caught as I read the subject line, "Collateral Agreement, Lakehouse Property." The message detailed their application for a sizable loan, listing my lakehouse as security. It bore both Celestine's and Marius's digital signatures. A bank officer copied in. My hands went cold. It had never been about temporary shelter. They had intended to gamble with the very roof that had sheltered me through grief. I closed the laptop slowly, the anger rising steady and sharp, no longer tangled with guilt. This was not just intrusion. It was an attempt to strip me of safety itself. By morning, my course was clear, and the strength in me felt immovable. They returned the following Sunday, this time with the children in tow. The moment their coats hit the hall rack, the performance began. "Grandma." "I get the blue room," the eldest announced, tugging on my sleeve. "No. I already called it." The younger snapped back, stamping her foot. Their quarrel sounded rehearsed, too sharp for childish squabbles. Celestine placed a hand to her chest as though to soothe her own heart. "See? Mother, they're already so excited. You wouldn't want to disappoint them." Marius stayed near the window, eyes down, silence pressed tight between his teeth. Mrs. Greffin sank into my armchair with a long sigh. "Family duty. Eudora, it's not complicated. A mother helps her child. A grandmother helps her grandchildren. That's what decent families do." Her words scraped across my patience like sandpaper. I set down the teapot with care, refusing to let my hands betray the fire I felt inside. When Celestine leaned forward, voice softening into faux concern, I knew the next blow before it landed. "You'll regret this. Mother, when we revise the will, you don't want to be remembered as unkind. In years past, that threat would have unmoored me. Tonight it only steadied me. A clarity, cool and certain, ran through my veins like iron. I looked from daughter to mother-in-law, from silent son-in-law to the children still bickering over rooms they would never have. Harold's voice rose in memory. His favorite saying from the early years of our marriage boundaries, our love spelled in stone. For the first time, I understood it fully. Saying no wasn't cruelty. It was the purest form of care for my home, for myself, for the woman I had fought to become. I folded my hands in my lap and smiled, not in surrender but in quiet defiance. The house would stand, and so would I. When Monday dawned, my phone buzzed with the first alert from the security system I had upgraded just in time. The chime on my phone startled me before sunrise. I reached for it, expecting a weather alert, and instead saw the words, "Unauthorized entry attempt detected lakehouse property." I slipped on my coat and drove the familiar winding road to Lake Junaluska, my hands steady on the wheel despite the rush of adrenaline. By the time I turned onto the gravel drive, a moving truck idled at the edge of the property, its engine rumbling against the quiet morning. Celestine was already at the front steps. Jamming a key into the lock, I stayed back in the car, watching as she twisted harder, confusion spreading across her face. Then the mechanical voice of the new system broke the air. Trespass recorded. Authorities notified. The tone was calm, almost polite, but it landed like a verdict. Celestine jumped back, startled, before spotting the small camera perched beneath the eaves. Her cheeks flamed as she realized she was caught mid-crime. Marius lingered by the truck, his shoulders slumped, not daring to meet her eyes. I watched the scene through my screen as well, each angle captured in crisp footage. Celestine screamed into the lens, a string of words I'd heard too many times, her voice rising in fury rather than shame. I tapped twice and forwarded the file to my attorney. Evidence. Clean and undeniable. From the driver's seat, I saw her pace the porch, fists balled at her sides, while Marius muttered something I couldn't catch. He looked like a man already regretting the role he'd been forced to play. The children stayed hidden in the cab of the truck, peeking through the window, wide-eyed at their mother's rage. I did not step out. There was no need. The camera, the locks, the digital record, they spoke for me louder than any confrontation could. When the truck finally reversed down the lane, spitting gravel in frustration, I let out a long breath. Their performance had ended, and I held the script in my hands. By evening, the footage was stored in 3 places, and the first email from my lawyer arrived with the subject line, "Proceed as planned." 2 days later, I returned from town to find my front yard littered with furniture. Dressers, chairs, even a dining table I recognized from Celestine's house sat crooked on my grass. Legs sinking into the soil, a note scrawled in her hand was taped to the largest piece, "Just until the renovations are done. Family helps family." I stood at the edge of the lawn, taking in the mess. She thought clutter would shame me, that her belongings would weigh me down with inconvenience. What she didn't know was that I had been planning for this, too. An hour later, the truck from Blue Ridge Auction House rumbled into the drive. I greeted the men with a smile and pointed toward the piles. "Everything here." I told them. "You know the arrangement." They loaded each piece with professional efficiency, careful not to scratch the wood. Receipts were signed, photographs taken, documentation secured. By mid-afternoon, my lawn was clear again, the grass bent but breathing. That evening, word spread quickly through town. The auction proceeds, as I had arranged, would be directed to the foster youth program in Waynesville. The director called to thank me, her voice breaking with emotion. "This will furnish the group home for years," she said. By contrast, whispers about Celestine's greed trailed behind me in the market aisles and at the post office. People had seen the movers, seen her furniture carted off, and now they saw the announcement of the donation. Her attempt to burden me had turned into a public blemish on her reputation. When Celestine stormed up my walk that night, her face blotched with fury, She spat the word heirlooms as if I had committed a crime. I only handed her a copy of the receipt, proof of the good her discarded things would do. Her scream carried into the dark, but I closed my door gently, certain the real work of rebuilding would begin at the lakehouse itself. They came to the lakehouse on a Thursday, just as the contractors were pulling down the last of the interior walls. I heard their car crunch over the gravel drive, doors slamming with the force of people preparing for battle. My parents climbed the porch steps, faces set like stone. Inside, the house was alive with noise saws buzzing, hammers striking, the air sharp with the scent of pine. Sunlight poured through the exposed beams, scattering across the floor in golden lines. The space looked nothing like the rooms they remembered. It was stripped bare, ready for a future I had chosen. "Eudora, what have you done?" my father shouted over the racket. "You've destroyed it. I'm rebuilding it." I said evenly, on my terms. Mother clutched his arm, her voice trembling but rehearsed. "Think of Celestine's children. A grandmother should help, not turn them away." Their words landed like echoes from an old script, but I no longer played that part. I stood taller, sawdust clinging to my shoes, and gestured toward the open framework. "This house will never be theirs to claim." My father's mouth thinned into a line. "Then you leave us no choice. When we adjust the will, don't expect anything." I almost laughed. "That's already been done," I said. "This lake house is in a charitable trust, filed months ago. Even when I'm gone, it will remain untouchable for the first time." They faltered. Silence replaced outrage, their eyes darting around the gutted space as though searching for leverage in the beams themselves. But there was none. The law stood stronger than their threats. Above us, sunlight streamed through the rafters, warm and unyielding. I felt it touch my face like a blessing. The house was bare, but it was alive. Just as I was rebuilt from the ground up, I turned back to the foreman, who raised his clipboard expectantly. "Proceed with the next phase," I told him, already hearing the future rising from wood and nails. 6 months later, the lake house stood renewed. Fresh cedar siding gleamed in the morning light, and wide windows framed the shimmer of Lake Junaluska as if the water itself had become part of the walls. Inside, hardwood floors caught every step like a quiet song, and the scent of cut pine lingered as though the house still remembered its rebirth. I filled it with laughter that day. Friends from town arrived with casseroles and bottles of wine. Neighbors brought roses from their gardens, and the foster youth program sent a handful of teenagers who had helped haul the donated furniture months before. They wandered through the rooms with wide eyes, marveling at the vaulted ceilings and the view from the porch. For once, the lake house was alive with voices chosen by me, not demanded by obligation. We ate together at a long table I had built from reclaimed boards. Each plank, bearing the marks of storms, survived. There was music. One of the boys strummed a guitar while the others sang along, their laughter carrying across the water long after the sun began to set. In the midst of it, my phone buzzed. A message from Celestine lit the screen. "Dinner next month. Bring dessert." Simple words, an apology hidden between the lines. I typed back slowly, each letter deliberate. "Yes, but the house is mine." When the guests left and quiet returned, I stepped onto the porch with a single rose in my hand. I placed it in the small vase on the railing, the petals catching the last gold light of evening. My reflection in the glass door looked older, yes, but steadier than the woman who once folded napkins to hold herself together. Respecting boundaries isn't cruelty, it's adulthood. If your child handed your keys to someone else, would you surrender or rebuild your life? Key by key.